Welcome. My name's Henry Jackson. I'm the chairman of the board of Francis Burt Chambers. Welcome to the Francis Burt Oration. We start with an acknowledgement of country. We acknowledge that we meet on the land of the Whadjuk Noongar people. We acknowledge that the Whadjuk Noongar people did not consent to their land being taken from them, and that dispossession has ongoing legal and moral consequences. We acknowledge that despite that dispossession, the Whadjuk Noongar people have a deep and unique ongoing relationship with this land, and we honour their leaders past and present. We also acknowledge our special and distinguished guests tonight. I won't name them all, but we welcome in particular the members or some members of the Federal Court, the Supreme Court and the District Court. We welcome Amanda Forrester SC, Director of Public Prosecutions, and the Honourable Nick Goyron, MLC Shadow Attorney General. We're also very pleased that members of the family of Sir Francis Burt are able to be with us tonight, Janine and Steve Milton. Sir Francis Burt was admitted to practice in 1941 and took silk in 1959. He founded the bar in Western Australia 60 years ago this year, and in 1962, with 3 others, established the set of chambers that now bears his name. He served on the Supreme Court from 1969 to 1988, including 11 years as Chief Justice. 33 years have now passed since he retired from the bench, and the majority of the 130 or so barristers in Francis Burt Chambers never appeared in front of him, let alone knew him as a barrister. Those who did appear before him speak of his comprehensive knowledge of the law and the clarity, accuracy and brevity of his expression. They also speak of his humility, his sense of service and his sense of propriety. The Sir Francis Burt Oration seeks to honour his enormous legacy by asking leaders of the law and other professions to share their considered thoughts on present and emerging matters of interest and importance to the legal profession, particularly where the law and the profession intersect with broader society. In just a moment, I will introduce our speaker for this evening, Professor Helen Milroy, who will speak to just before 6:30 p.m, at which time I'll thank her and invite you all to join us for drinks and canapes at the rear of the hall. Professor Milroy has a CV that makes you wonder what you've been doing with your life. She is a descendant of the Bulgu people of the Pilbara region and was Australia's first Indigenous doctor. She's a highly regarded expert in child and adolescent psychiatry, having pioneered research, education and training in Aboriginal child mental health and recovery from grief and trauma. She holds the Stan Perrin Chair of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry at the Perth Children's Hospital and the University of Western Australia. Among far too many roles to mention, she was until recently a member of the National Mental Health Commission and is currently a commissioner and the first Indigenous Commissioner of the Australian Football League. She's also a talented artist and published author whose books have been shortlisted for several major awards. She is Western Australia's 2021 Australian of the Year. Most relevantly, between 2013 and 2017, Professor Milroy was a Commissioner for the Australian Government's Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse. That experience informs tonight's oration, which is titled The Power of Disclosure and the Experience of the Royal Commission. Please welcome Professor Helen Milroy.
It's very high stage, isn't it? So sorry that I actually feel like I'm all looking down upon you, but believe me, I feel quite intimidated actually. I'm not used to speaking to this particular audience, and I think the only time I felt more intimidated was doing storytelling to 6-year-olds. The experience of the Royal Commission was, I have to say, absolutely life-changing. People have asked me what it was like, and I have said it was both profoundly disturbing and incredibly inspiring and intense for a 5-year period that probably changed all of us who worked on the Commission forever. So with that in mind, that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today, and some of the reflections, particularly around this issue of bearing of witness and disclosure, because this was one of the most powerful things that I experienced throughout the whole 5 years, and I think it will stay with me forever. So this is just a quote from one of our people who attended a private session, and comes from the book of sort of comments or messages to Australia that we published at the end of the Royal Commission. And I think it sort of sums up a lot of the experiences that people had, that these sorts of experiences never leave you. They stay with you lifelong, and they come back and revisit you at various times in your life. And this was one of the most common stories that we heard, that trauma never actually goes away. Just in terms of who I am, this is my grandmother. I'm a Pelku woman. We're from the Pilbara region in Western Australia, around Marble Bar. Beautiful time to go in winter, but don't go in summer, it's way too hot. And I think that when we understand these stories of trauma, we also have to understand it within a generational context. So as my grandmother holds my mother holds me, and I hold my child, a bit younger in that photo. And that's how it should be, but for many of our children who were in institutional care, that was not their story, and their story was disrupted and full of a whole pile of trauma that they found difficult to explain, difficult to talk about, but stayed with them lifelong. In my tradition of storytelling, I'm actually going to begin this oration with a story that just illustrates, I think, the importance of memory. This is called Frog and Barramundi. The little green frog sat at the edge of the waterhole watching the ripples in the water. It was so beautiful and clear you could almost see the coloured stones lying on the bottom, except the movement of the water put them out of focus. The little green frog longed to swim to the bottom, but he knew it was too deep. It was very deceiving because the water was so pure. He would love to have collected some of the coloured stones. Suddenly a large barramundi swam into the waterhole and rested on the colourful stones. "Are you looking at my pretty stones, Frog?" asked the barramundi. "Yes," Frog replied, "but I'm too small to swim to the bottom of your waterhole, but I would love to have one." Barramundi swam to the surface with a bright red stone in his mouth. "Here is a present for you, Frog," he said, giving Frog the red stone. "Oh, thank you, Barramundi, but I haven't got a present to give you." "You can give me one of those blue flowers that grow on the rocks," Barramundi said. Frog picked a blue flower and gave it to Barramundi. "The pretty stones you see I have been collecting since I was young," Barramundi said. "They are my memories. The red stone is full of happy memories." "Oh, thank you. I will treasure it always," said Frog. Each day Frog would visit the waterhole. Each day Barramundi would give Frog a pretty stone. In turn, Frog gave Barramundi a lovely flower. The little green frog was enjoying the beautiful coloured stones as they made him feel very happy, but he didn't visit the waterhole for a while. "I will go and visit my friend today," he thought, and set off for the waterhole where his friend Barramundi lived. Barramundi was floating on top of the water with a black stone in his mouth and surrounded by half-dead and rotting flowers. You can't give away your past memories. You need them to see the future. There are many ways to understand this story. We often take stories from our communities and the people that we see within our services with very little in return. As trust is developed, the black stones will emerge. If we are not there and ready to hear and understand these stories, it can have catastrophic consequences. This is why the bearing of witness is so important. Stories build a picture which we cannot make sense of until we hear the whole story. As we hold those precious stories in our minds and hearts, it is our shared responsibility to honour those stories and create hope for a better future. So the Royal Commission was set up in 2013. It ran for 5 years. We saw people from all over Australia. We went to all the states and territories. We went to all of the various different institutions, and we also conducted private sessions within all of the maximum security jails across Australia. Our aims were to better protect children, to achieve best practice in reporting and responding to child sexual abuse, and to, of course, alleviate the impact of past experiences. The 3 pillars of our work included our private sessions, public hearings, policy and research. It was really, really hard to cram 5 years of work into a 1-hour presentation. So I've already apologised to Henry because I have way too many slides, so don't blink. But we won't go through all of them in detail, but they're just there for reference if you'd like to look at them later on. We saw many thousands of people throughout the 5 years. We did 8,000 private sessions. We received many written accounts, and we also referred a lot of matters to the police. We had our own internal police force that was working with us. And as I said, we held sessions and hearings all over Australia. We had 57 public hearings. Some of you may have seen some of those. It was all live streamed. In fact, it was interesting because every time we held a particular public hearing on a particular institution, there was a flood of referrals then for people who'd been in that particular institution. We had lots of documents. In fact, some of our documents were sent to us in Latin. That was an interesting experience. And overall, we examined over 100 institutions. In fact, when you think about all of the institutions that were complained about, any situation where a child was in any form of care, there was the capacity or the possibility of exploitation and abuse. In policy and research, we had lots of policy roundtables. We tried to take all of the policymakers with us on the journey so that there were no surprises at the end, so we had lots of policy roundtables as we went through. We also had a lot of original research that we published, and if you care to look at the criminal justice report that we also produced separately to our final report, there's some very interesting issues there that were explored both in research and in recommendations. And we published 59 research reports. It was an enormous task, absolutely enormous task. So what we heard in private sessions, we considered accounts from all survivors. We had children who were talking to us still in their childhood, as well as adults in their 90s who came to speak to us about things that had happened some 70 or 80 years earlier. We had some special ways of dealing with some of our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, as well as our ethnically and linguistically diverse communities, as well as adults with disabilities. And as I said, we also went and saw people within the prisons as well. We didn't conduct private sessions in the juvenile justice settings, mainly because adolescents weren't in for long enough. We saw a lot of those kids out in the community. And we had an analysis of the information that was provided to us during the private sessions, the nature of the abuse, the circumstances, as well as issues around survival and well-being. When we look at the breakdown of the data, about just over 60% of the people that came to see us were men. This is quite unusual in the area of sexual assault because often you hear a lot about women. But in actual fact, there were a lot of men who had never really disclosed before, and this presented a very unique opportunity for them to come and tell their stories. And about 15% were Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. And as I said, we saw kids who were kids at the time, as well as people up into their 90s, but about the average age was in the 50s. It's probably a bit small, that slide, but that just shows you some of the types of institutions. Obviously, the two really big areas where there was institutional abuse was in the out-of-home care environments, the very large orphanages that we had. Some of them we had here in Perth in Western Australia and throughout the state. In fact, when you looked at the missions where Aboriginal kids were taken, we had the most missions of any country, of any state or territory throughout Australia. Often I think about something like 5 times more than they had in New South Wales. But essentially any institution where they had the care of children was open to exploitation. So when we think about the impacts, in order to understand disclosure, you also need to understand the impacts and how it impacts on development. I would probably say 100% identified impacts on mental health, but at least 95% did, and that included self-harm. And some of that self-harm occurred at a very early age, just after the trauma had started happening. Lots of people described issues with all different aspects of their development, including their relationships, their education, their difficulties with intimacy. And some of the other areas that are less well known are the impact that it had on a child's ability to understand what love is, to experience joy, and to ever be at peace. The sense of isolation was also quite profound. A lot of people described to us it was almost like a force field came down over them once these traumas started to happen. They could not reach out and they could not allow anyone to reach in. And that sense of profound isolation often remained with them lifelong. And of course, as I alluded to earlier, the permanency of the traumatic memory was really quite profound. And in fact, it comes back to bite you in later life, particularly when you start to age and your defence mechanisms also start to age. Traumatic memories get thrown back up into your consciousness. So as people age, they go back to living those lives, those traumatic lives during their earlier life experiences. So what we know from trauma is it can disrupt all spheres of development. It fragments memory and recall. It disrupts the coherence of the personal narrative, which is one of the reasons why it's so hard for people to give evidence, because there's a neurobiological basis to this. And of course, it's a risk factor for negative life outcomes. So in terms of disclosure, it took on average 24 years for people to tell their story. That's massive. That means that there's 24 years of impact that's occurring in that time from when things first start happening to when they're able to get some sort of help or relief. And of course, for a lot of the people who came to us at the Royal Commission, and for some groups it was higher than 10%, this was the first time they had actually spoken to anyone about their story. And for a lot of people, although they'd spoken before, they actually remarked that this was the first time they'd felt heard. So there was something very, very different about the way they were telling us their story and the way we were listening. And of course it means that adults may disclose in any service, and I'm sure for all of you who work in this area, it's quite likely that you would get first-time disclosures. So what we understood from the disclosures was that many disclosures occurred over many years. The story often unfolded over time. It was very rare that the story would all come out in one sort of session, although by the time they got to us in the private session, they'd already put their story together. Reporting, as I said, was often delayed, with a delayed response to any action. Criminal justice processes took many, many years, which meant that there was no relief to the story because there was a lot of waiting and they felt in limbo for many, many years, sometimes 10 or 15 years before it actually got to court. That's a long time to hold these stories and wait for justice. And of course, the redress responses were often inadequate, inappropriate, traumatising, or just slow. These are some quotes that I've dotted in throughout the presentation just to give you a real sense of how people felt about the experience of coming to the Royal Commission. And again, this is about how long it takes for people to actually have the ability, the capacity or the courage just to be able to speak of things which for them beforehand were just unspeakable. It took 1 year of viewing the advertisements to write to the Royal Commission. It then took 1 year to get to the table of the Royal Commission. After holding 50 years of shame, anger and pain, it then took 1 year to write this message. And he goes on to talk about this being a cathartic process. That's a really, really long time to be sitting with these very, very deep and troubling emotions. So in terms of identifying child sexual abuse, it is a critical step if we're going to be able to protect children. However, we know that if disclosures are delayed, then it's very, very difficult to identify what's going on for our children. So we need to be able to assist in making disclosures easier and sooner than what we were seeing in the Royal Commission. Also, given the covert nature of child sexual abuse, sometimes the only way to know what is going on is to actually get a disclosure, which sometimes I suppose when I think about all of the stories from the past, most of the time when people did speak up, particularly when they were children, they weren't believed. And of course, what we know about disclosure, when you get a negative reaction, the chances are you will not disclose again for many, many years. And then that impact is going to be cumulative until you get another chance. There may be other ways to identify child sexual abuse from another victim or from the perpetrator's account himself. There may be witnesses, although that's very unusual. There's very little chance of getting physical evidence, although it was quite surprising to see how many people did have physical injuries, went to seek assistance from health services and were completely ignored in terms of their trauma story and sent back to the same institution. So there was a lot of denial in terms of health professionals as well. There may be child exploitation material, and I think that's become a bigger thing in the current scenario, particularly with all of the lockdowns and the pandemic we're in at the moment. The online sexual exploitation has increased. And of course there may be verbal and non-verbal cues and behavioural cues, as well as sexually acting out behaviour and deliberate self-harm in children that are cues that something is going on. It was really interesting to hear some of the stories where a person would say, as soon as things started happening, my grades at school went down. No one asked me what happened. No one asked me what was wrong. I was just told I was a bad student. These were really, really common stories, and from not so long ago either. All of the cues were missed. And sometimes, despite very clear disclosures from children, other potential victims were just overlooked or not identified. Even families failed to identify other children who'd been exposed to the same perpetrators. So there's something very fundamentally wrong with society in being able to accept that these things do happen to our children and how we go about dealing with them. When I first got appointed to the Royal Commission, I had a lot of people say to me, what about all the false allegations? I said, that's what you're worried about? You're not worried about the children who are suffering and who have experienced unspeakable traumas? By the end of the Royal Commission, no one asked me that anymore. So I'm really, really hoping that somehow we got the message across to the general public that these things do happen to children, and we do have to believe them, and we do have to take them forward if they're going to have any chance at recovery. So disclosure is really a one-off process. It's often ongoing, and it can be verbal, non-verbal, accidental, or intentional, partial or complete. And people will disclose at different times in their lives to different people throughout their lives. They may weigh up the benefits and consequences first. A lot of children that we saw in some of our stakeholder groups and roundtables said that they would test the water. So they might tell us, a parent or a teacher, something else that had happened to them, and then they'd wait and see what the response was. If that had been received positively and there'd been action taken, then they might trust that person with a little bit more of the information. If they were dismissed or it wasn't dealt with, they weren't prepared to go any further. So when we're dealing with survivors, whether they're children or adults, we don't know what the real story is ever going to be until we're prepared to actually listen to the full story, and it may come out in that piecemeal way. So the initial disclosure can be very vague, and language, especially for children, can be very difficult. They may not have the verbal skills at that point in time to be able to describe what did happen or make sense of it in any way. It's a clumsy way to be able to tell a story that you don't understand. They may partially disclose, retract, deny, and then reaffirm disclosure over time. That doesn't mean it's false. They may also refuse to talk any further after an initial disclosure, making it difficult to get the full story. Studies have identified the following reasons that a child might retract a disclosure. Pressure from the perpetrator, obviously, from families or others, and for some of our Aboriginal children, the fear of retribution and payback is a really big issue. Concern about negative personal consequences. Often children are threatened, and if the abuse continues into adulthood, adults are also equally threatened. Investigations by police or child protection services, and criminal proceedings. Kids get scared, adults get scared. It's very, very disturbing to have to talk about these stories over and over and over again and then be questioned about the truthfulness of them. It's hard enough to speak up in the first place, let alone to then be interrogated about what happened. There may be other things that complicate disclosure. As I said earlier, trauma impacts on the neurobiological development of the brain, and it's both its structure and its function, and it fragments memory. Children may also stop developing emotionally at points in time when trauma starts to happen. So you can have something like a developmental arrest, which actually prevents a child from being able to develop emotional language, for example, to describe their feelings or to develop emotional regulation. There may be other things like dissociation. I'm sure you may have all experienced this with people that you've seen, where they just check out. They're not sort of quite there anymore. They're acting on automatic pilot. That's a form of dissociation that comes from a trauma trigger. And if people are in that state, they can't talk to you, they can't respond in a normal way. Some survivors said that the best protective strategy was to act in a way that was compliant, and then that produces a lot of shame and guilt going forward, and whether they can then talk about their role in the abuse. And of course, many described how they felt very confused about what was happening to them and did not understand what it was all about until they were much older, particularly sort of mid-adolescence, young adulthood, when it suddenly actually dawned on them the experiences that they'd had at a much younger age. Of the survivors who told us they disclosed in childhood, most of them told us that they had disclosed while the abuse was still happening. That gives the child a chance then for removal or to a place of safety or for the abuse to stop. However, many of them told us that the disclosure didn't occur until much later on, as I said, about 24 years on average for disclosure in adulthood. Disclosure can also involve many steps, whether a victim chooses to disclose or not, when they disclose and who they disclose to. It was interesting with a lot of the men that came forward. They said they didn't come forward to help themselves. They didn't come forward to get help, to get counselling or to even get compensation. They came forward to save other children from this happening to them. I think that's probably something that is worth thinking about in terms of the way we actually have services, because people don't want to come in a deficit state. They may want help, but they don't want to be seen as in a deficit state, which is the problem with mental health services and support services. If their story has value, if it can help other children, and then within that process they receive help and support, that's a good way to engage people within services. There's also lots of other reasons why people might disclose. It might be triggered by a crisis, a life event. One of the most common reasons why women disclose sexual abuse in pregnancy is because pregnancy is such a powerful rekindler of traumatic memories. And because they had a period of decompensation during that time, they're able to then talk about what happened. This is just a case of one of the kids who talked about the idea of having to see his perpetrator again. And it got to such a crisis point, he just blurted it all out, what was happening to him. So often disclosures can be triggered by one of these crisis moments when the child might think that they're coming back in contact with the perpetrator. What was really difficult about the prison situation for a lot of the people that we saw was that often people who had been victims of child sexual abuse were in the same prisons as their perpetrators. That made it incredibly difficult for people to actually get the support and the safety within the prison environment that they needed. And there's many other reasons why people decide to disclose. Sometimes they wait until their parents have passed on, or there's other points in their life when they need to be able to speak about these matters. Of course, many barriers to disclosure as well, personal perpetrator factors as well as institutional factors, and we'll just talk a little bit about that. You're going to have to give me a signal too, Henry, because I'm probably going to go over time. And I do want to get to the self-care bit, which is really, really important. So in general, there are certain factors for the child that may impact on their ability to disclose, obviously their age and their developmental stage. Clearly, when children are less than 6 years of age, they don't necessarily have the verbal skills to be able to talk about what's happened to them. If they have a disability, particularly an intellectual disability or issues with their speech and language. Gender is another issue. Women are more likely, female children are more likely to disclose than boys. And certainly the transgender group reported significant difficulties in disclosing because it might actually then lead to them disclosing their issues with their sexuality. Community and cultural expectations, religious beliefs, all of those sorts of things we know about, and racism and discrimination, particularly for our Aboriginal communities. In terms of what the main barriers were in the group that we saw, a lot of people talked about shame and embarrassment. For men, it was the fear of being labelled a perpetrator. The fear that someone would think because they had been sexually abused, they would become a sexual abuser. And I think there's still a lot of myth and misconceptions and misunderstandings about that. The majority of people who have had these sorts of experience will not go on and perpetrate anything. However, there's this perception that for men in particular, because most of the perpetrators are men, that there's a higher tendency. Well, there's not. And of course, many people feared retribution. Some of the other issues around barriers were things like just the ability to communicate, feeling stigmatised, issues around sexual identity and masculinity. Obviously, because the majority of perpetrators were men, for boys it really did challenge their views of themselves and their sexual identity going into adolescence. And of course, disclosure could be very, very dangerous. We know some of the consequences of what happened to children when they did disclose. Sometimes they suffered worse abuse when they reported to the institutions than what they'd received beforehand. One survivor had said, I just haven't wanted to speak to anybody about it until I saw the opportunity to say something. Had the Royal Commission not been established, I would have gone to my grave with this. And I'm sure there's still a lot of people around who are like that, who don't feel able, do not feel that there's a place where they can go, where they can safely disclose, or where they'll be believed. And other barriers that prevent delayed disclosure can be so strong that even when asked directly, they will deny it. Even if they're applying for redress, they will deny the sexual abuse part of it. We saw a lot of people who applied, you know, when WA redress scheme was around? We saw a lot of people who had applied for WA redress hadn't disclosed the sexual abuse. And then they came to the Royal Commission later on down the track and disclosed to us, so they missed that opportunity even when there was going to be compensation. And even if they've heard other people's stories, these barriers can be really, really powerful. And of course, people sometimes are just not ready when someone does ask them what happens, as this woman's described, being asked by her father and just saying no. And of course, often we want to hear that there's a no. That's what we want to hear. We don't want to know that our children really have had these awful experiences. So of course, a lot of parents just took at face value when a child said no, it hadn't happened, instead of actually maintaining that sense of suspicion if there were real circumstances under which this could have occurred. And with perpetrator behaviours, we know that there were a lot of grooming tactics used. I think one of the really strongest grooming tactics that were used within institutions was to isolate the child, create a negative reputation for the child. So if the child did say anything, people already thought they were a liar, and that the perpetrator then was the person who knew everything, did everything, and told the truth. That was a really, really common story. In fact, grooming was a really big part of the institutional environment. Using religious beliefs was another one. And also saying that the parents of the child knew and accepted that this was okay or condoned the relationship. So this is a comment from one of the survivors. They work on the parents trust them. Once the parents turn their back, that is when they make their move. And sometimes when families were at their most vulnerable, that's when abuse occurred. When a parent had died in a family and a priest went round to console the family, it was under those circumstances when abuse started to occur, because no one was going to believe it would happen under those circumstances, but that's exactly when the family and the child were at its most vulnerable. Violence, of course, and cultures of fear. Other institutional barriers to disclosure were things like prioritising prestige and reputation and loyalty over children's safety. We saw that mostly in the elite private schools. In fact, we did a few public hearings on quite a few of the elite private schools across Australia. The strong relationships between adults, which then tended to have less care for the children that they were caring for, and of course where there was poor policies and procedures and avenues for disclosure. We also found that a lot of institutions had incredibly poor record keeping and lack of training. In fact, most people were looking outside of the institution for abuse instead of within their own walls. Also, authorities failed to listen, and these are just some examples that people talk to us about. They just laughed it off, totally disregarded it. What's also interesting, I suppose, or what's, again, part of transgenerational trauma is if you've been in institutional care, you're more likely to have your children in institutional care. So, of course, for a lot of the people who had experienced sexual abuse in care, their main concern was that this would happen to their children when they were in care, and in fact it did. So who did children tell first? Generally sort of their parents or someone in authority. Some would turn to a friend. Adolescents are more likely to tell their peers. Adults are more likely to tell a partner or a therapist, someone from the police or a representative of the criminal justice system. Less likely to tell someone from the institution. In terms of attitudes towards children and whether we believe children in society, there was a survey done in 2009, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but there was a lot of concern that came forward about false allegations, a lack of understanding about impact and memory, myths and misconceptions about children in general as well as children with a disability. And in fact, some of the notions around children are resilient, they'll get over it, they won't remember it, they won't understand it, so it doesn't matter. All wrong. They will remember it. They may not understand it, but they'll make sense of it at some point in time, and they will not get over it without some assistance. So there was a survey done back in 2009. I know it's a little bit old now, but I think it's probably still relevant. 32% of respondents believe that children make up stories about being abused, and 24% did not agree or could not make up their mind whether to believe a child who disclosed experiences. I think that's really shocking. I really hope we're better than that now, but I do wonder. Other issues in terms of disclosure that prevent kids and adults from disclosing is some of the religious beliefs, fear of outside influence or trouble, censoring of children's voices, and for some religious groups, and particularly for women, that idea of marriageability if there'd been abuse in an earlier period of time. Disability, obviously, problematic attitudes towards kids with a disability, believing that children who are disabled are asexual or promiscuous, meaning that they've caused it themselves, that they may lie or exaggerate and they're not credible. This made it very difficult for children with a disability to get any sort of support when they were trying to disclose, and for non-verbal kids, even more difficult. And we certainly did a public hearing on children with a disability where I'd been the bus driver. And it took a long, long time for anyone to finally make sense of those children's stories, even though the behavioural indicators were there for years. No one thought to look any further. And of course, for children with a disability, they often got punished. And I think it's very disturbing when someone tells you that they were taken to hospital from the injuries and just told that they weren't going to do anything about it. In terms of the impact of disclosure, it can be positive or negative. These are just two different examples of both a negative impact of disclosure and a positive one. So for the first person, they felt like finally disclosing meant a complete unravelling, and then the levels of distress that they experienced. So disclosure isn't without its consequences. Sometimes people feel that if they hold it in, they'll be okay. Unfortunately, it's going to come out at some point in time, and if it doesn't come out verbally, it'll come out physically, because we also know that undisclosed trauma causes a lot of impact on stress systems, and our immune system causes physical health problems and disability throughout life. And of course, someone else describing a very positive impact of disclosure. He said, and I like the last line here, he said, "I walked out of his office like a ton weight had been lifted off me." That's more the experience that we had with the survivors in the Royal Commission. Overwhelmingly, the reaction to the disclosure was a positive one. Is reporting improving? There's some evidence that it is, but not to the extent that it should be. And in order to support disclosure for children, they have to have access to safe adults, they have to be able to raise concerns, they have to have the language in which to do so, and the tools to communicate. And for youth, they talked about wanting a genuine person. And to them, a genuine person was someone who actually took an interest in them and actually reacted to them like a proper person, rather than someone who was in authority. And that was particularly relevant for children in the juvenile justice system. And for adults, it's important to have positive responses, access to support groups, people being able to speak out publicly about this so that they can feel that they can identify with these sorts of issues, as well as the redress schemes and other sort of helplines. In terms of some people who, basically I asked everybody that I did a private session with, what would have made a difference for you to disclose earlier? For some people, and particularly men, they said nothing. Nothing would have made a difference. If it hadn't have been for the Royal Commission, they would have taken this to their grave. Some people said a greater awareness in society, a greater sensitivity in services, the anti-stigma messages, champions, all of those sorts of things. And a lot of people talked about having an appropriate justice response. Now, many people experience reporting to police or to lawyers or some sort of services with a negative response. So actually having a positive justice response, they thought would encourage people to come forward. We know notoriously it's difficult to get these sorts of cases through to conviction. So I'm going to talk a little bit about trauma-informed approaches and why it's so important to have these sorts of approaches. If you're not aware of a consumer's history of past or current abuse, it's difficult to have the level of sensitivity required for that person to feel safe and comfortable within your service environment. And the service itself, the whole system, has to have an understanding of the role of violence and victimisation in the lives of consumers. I've put mental health services there, but any services, that doesn't actually matter. And how we then use that information to design our service systems so that we create a positive therapeutic response going forward. It's very, very, very easy to shut down a survivor. It's much harder to try and actually have an environment that's supportive and empowering But it's actually not hard to do. We just need to be able to do it. Some of the engagement principles that we used for a trauma-informed response with the Royal Commission was to make sure we had a very safe and supportive environment for our survivors, being very alert to how people might respond to their trigger responses. If people reacted very adversely, you had to be non-judgmental. You had to understand that might be a trigger, that might be a response to their earlier trauma, and to not take sort of these things on board and label people as aggressive, to be respectful and listen, to have a strengths-based approach in dealing with our survivors, to always offer hope, and to support providing choice and control when people came to see us. So the ability to choose who they saw, when they had their private session, how they wanted to tell their story. We tried to be as flexible as we could and to be as responsive as we could as well. In fact, the only place we could find, I'll put this out to you guys, you know we did the private sessions in hotels? Because that was the only neutral place we could find that wasn't going to cause a trigger in terms of institutional environments. So we did a lot of our work in hotels over the 5 years. So many survivors told us how important it was to them to tell their story to Commissioner in their eyes, who represented the highest authority in the land. They felt that the Australian government and the people of Australia were finally taking them seriously. And what they had to say about their experience of child sexual abuse was valued, that it mattered and that they mattered. And for many, many people we spoke to, that was the first time they had actually felt like that, which I think is actually very sad. So Marlene disclosed to a psychiatrist after 50 years and had recently raised it with her 2 sons before attending her private session. I never told a soul. I grew up with such dominating fear I couldn't understand why. If it wasn't for the Royal Commission, we'd all go to our graves with these horrors in our memory and nobody knowing about them. I think it's a miracle, really. I don't know what other word to use. All of these people are having these memories, are getting set free. Powerful, isn't it? So how we did the private sessions, we had initial contact by phone, email, letter or community engagement. We had lots of people trained on how to be that sort of first response and first contact. They always were referred to a counsellor or support services as needed. We had a keep warm process, so we always kept people informed ahead of time. That was one of the things people found really difficult about some of the criminal trials, was that they weren't kept informed. They were just left hanging, and I think being in a state of limbo when you're a trauma survivor is re-traumatising. Sometimes it would be up to a year or so. Our wait list was actually very long. They would prepare their story for us and then they would come into the private session. And of course we adapted the model depending on the circumstances. In fact, for some of the Aboriginal communities we did like a healing weekend to allow them to tell their stories. In the private sessions they were seen by a single commissioner plus a commission officer. We did a free narrative approach and it was about help giving versus help seeking. We valued their opinion, their insights and recommendations. It was very non-interrogative. It allowed the person to just go at their own pace. Just start at the beginning was all we would say. And they would build the story and we would provide these clarifying moments. There was a lot of acknowledgement and validation and compassion that went on through the telling of the story. And the control and pace was with the survivor. 10 minutes, okay. I'm going to skip a whole pile of slides in a minute. I have to tell you, I thought I was a good listener until I did the Royal Commission. And then for the first time in my life, and I have taken thousands of disclosures of trauma stories as a clinician, but this was the first time in my life I was free to listen as a whole person. I believe that's one of the things that made the biggest difference, because all of the commissioners did the same thing. Most of the time when we're taking stories, taking transcripts, doing interviews, we're not listening as a whole person. We've got half our brain focused on the next question, what I have to do, what do I have to find out, what am I going to do about this? For me, in psychiatry, it's about risk assessment and other sorts of questionings to clarify what the diagnosis is. This was an absolute gift and a privilege to be able to listen with the whole person and react with a human, compassionate response instead of a clinical response. I really say to you, if you want to get the fullest story out of the people that you see, allow some time for a free narrative. Allow the person to go at their own pace. Don't keep throwing questions. And you'll find that you'll get the full story out much, much sooner than you otherwise would. And in a much broader way as well. So, disclosure can be powerful. Very, very powerful. And for many people it was a pivotal moment. I'm shutting Pandora's box this year. I've handed it to you now. Here you go, you deal with it. People felt relieved. People came into the session disempowered and distressed. They left the session walking tall, feeling relieved, feeling like they could move on with their lives. And that bore out to be true as well, because we did a lot of follow-up with people, and even some years down the track, people were still doing extremely well. So the private sessions allowed the bearing of witness. That was a very powerful process. The distressed child and the courageous adult were often present in the room together. It was empowering and inspiring. Feedback was overwhelmingly positive, and we had a sustained impact. It was a pivotal moment, a turning point that allowed a shift or change to occur. Engagement with services often occurred as a result of people coming forward to help others, and they then went off to report to police and sometimes had successful prosecutions. But this disclosure was different. They felt heard for the first time because we were able to listen with the whole person and provide a normal, human, compassionate response. We didn't hide. Just want to talk very briefly, I know I've only got a few minutes left. This is hard work. This is really, really hard work. And the three components to the stress that come along with this work are the general workplace stress, so our time frames, our timelines, our pressures that we have to do. I mean, 5 years of intense work was exhausting, physically and emotionally exhausting. Then you have to look at the trauma as well. There's compassion fatigue. Being able to be compassionate constantly, listening to traumatic stories and provide that human response costs you. It actually costs you your own empathy. And you will get compassion fatigue. It's like a form of burnout where you're unable to mount that compassionate response anymore. This can be really disturbing for people, and it certainly can be quite debilitating if it's not dealt with proactively. On the flip side of compassion fatigue is compassion satisfaction. We all have a level of altruism, and we do actually get benefit out of feeling like we're helping others. Then there's the vicarious traumatisation side. Listening to traumatic stories will cause you to have a PTSD-like syndrome. After a while, that's what will start to happen. You'll start to think about your own safety. You'll start to have nightmares and flashbacks about stories that you've heard or experiences that people have told you about or the experiences that you've had with your clients. The flip side of vicarious trauma is vicarious resilience. You will also hear wonderful stories about survival that inspire you to do more and to actually learn different things. However, if you don't deal with these things up front and in a proactive way, you will burn out. We will all burn out, as most of us may have done at some point in our careers. We ended up developing a very proactive staff support system. We knew that this was going to be difficult, and we evaluated how our staff were going with psychometric surveys over the 5 years of the commission, but we didn't start until year one, so it was mostly over 4 years. And our staff were doing better than most, had lower levels of psychological distress than the normal the rest of the population. So we were doing very well. I really say to all of you, if there's one take-home message from this, if you're going to do disclosures and bearing of witness well, you must look after yourselves, because you cannot bear witness if you are burnt out and traumatised yourself. I ended up having a supervision with a psychiatrist every 6 to 8 weeks for the whole duration of the Royal Commission. If I hadn't had that, I would not have retained my resilience to do the work in the way that I did. We also had in-house support programs, which I won't go into, but it's all there. So I'm just going to finish with the last few things in terms of what you might need to reflect on your services. Do you have the right starting point when people come into your services? Do you have an atmosphere that gives them dignity, respect, regard? Is it a warm place to come? Would you be comfortable in your service environment disclosing deeply traumatic and personal stories? I know in some of our mental health services, I wouldn't. They're awful places to be, really, really awful, and they're quite re-traumatising. Do we know how to bear witness well? Do we know where the story begins? Do we know how to respond in a way that's going to help the person move forward? Can we give them that pivotal moment, which can be quite critical in their development? And how do we manage the staff distress, the vicarious traumatisation and the compassion fatigue that most of us will experience at some point in our careers? In fact, when you read sort of the evidence base around this, most people come to the conclusion that you'll become sadder but wiser. I'm happy with that. But if you don't do it well, you may just become sad. And how do we ensure that we have safe journeys? We know that trauma disrupts the narrative, the personal narrative. How can we make sure our interviews are not deficit-based, disruptive, interrogative and judgmental? We know that court processes are re-traumatising and add to secondary trauma. How can we make sure that our journey through the legal system can be more trauma-informed and more therapeutic so that people actually get the right response and survive? We heard many stories about people becoming suicidal after going through the court processes. That could end up being a very, very tragic outcome for someone. So I'll just finish with a couple of things. The bearing of witness, when it's done well, is a powerful process for an individual, a community, or a collective. It allows for an understanding of an impact in order to preserve a positive sense of self and a positive identity to move forward. It helps to shift attitudes and shape responses. It's part of truth and reconciliation. And it also helps to create a coherent narrative for a positive future. One of the things I found in the bearing of witness that we did in the private sessions was it was the first time the person had actually joined all the dots in their life. And that's why it was so powerful, because at the end of that, they had this aha moment where things made sense. And of course, if we want to have the right foundations for our children going forward and to reduce the levels of trauma that they experience, we have to create the right story within strong relationships by adults who believe and provide opportunity for children to disclose. We have to understand their context through a cultural lens, have a responsive service system that's both trauma-informed and competent within collaborative systems of care and within a compassionate society. I believe we can all do better if we work together. Thank you.
This is the third year of the Sir Francis Burt Oration. Past orations have been given by members of the legal profession, but tonight we've had the benefit of a different perspective, and we are the better for it. Professor Milroy has spoken eloquently about the power of bearing witness and the benefits for survivors of doing so. She's also spoken about the difficulties and the barriers to disclosure and the difficulties of identifying those barriers. Those issues raise important questions as to how the law and the profession deal with those that have suffered trauma and what is required for justice to be done. Professor Milroy has also discussed the need for professionals to protect and preserve their own mental health when working with survivors of trauma, which is a vital issue that I think the legal profession is only just starting to grapple with. Can I please, on behalf of Francis Burt Chambers, thank Professor Milroy and ask you to join me in doing so. Before I invite you to join us for refreshments, I'd like to acknowledge the work done by Pauline McKay and the staff of Francis Burt Chambers in preparing for this event, and can I also ask you to thank them in the usual way.